Benjamin Butterworth, are you standing by your fellow woke-topians, Harry and Meghan? Do you still love these two? Do you still think they're a great example of what it means to be woke these days?
I mean, look, there's good news for taxpayers because we need never have paid for Frogmore Cottage because I think Harry and Meghan are living rent-free in your mind forever. You are completely obsessed with this couple.
You don't think this is a big story?
I think it's a big story, but I'm utterly tired of it.
Here's your newspaper. Here's your
of interest to lots of people what they say, but generally I think people are exhausted about the whole circus.
They're trying to destroy the royal family.
Whether it's tedious opportunists like you who will tear apart Meghan Markle for anything she says, whether it's
I'll tell you who the tedious opportunist is. It's the Duchess of Sussex herself, who had an amazing opportunity to make real change from within the royal family and instead decided, you know what mattered to her? Money, money, money.
Well, I mean, I think that Meghan Markle is a private person, as is Prince
Harry.
The phrase, leave Meghan alone.
This is the woman.
She doesn't deserve this.
It was one of those days on TV where you could practically smell the manufactured outrage wafting through the screen. The kind of program designed not to inform but to provoke, to squeeze every last drop of scandal and suspicion out of one woman's existence. And right in the middle of it, in a panel full of voices that have built entire careers out of sneering at Meghan Sussex, Benjamin Butterworth said something so simple, so human, so drenched in the kind of basic truth that it rattled the entire set like a gust of wind blowing through a house of cards. I think people are exhausted by the whole circus. Leave Meghan alone. She doesn't deserve this. And you could see it in the way their faces twisted, in the way their smirks tightened, that it landed not because it was outrageous, but because it was too plain, too undeniable, too much of a mirror they didn't want to look into. And the fact that his words weren't met with humility, weren't even met with a moment of self-awareness, but were instead met with cackling laughter and sneers, tells you everything you need to know about the sickness at the heart of how Meghan Sussex has been treated by the British press and the media echo chamber that keeps them in business. Because Butterworth wasn't really speaking into that room. He was speaking into the wider exhaustion that millions of people around the world feel when they scroll past yet another headline about Meghan's smile being too broad, her dress being too expensive, her body language being too controlling, her motherhood being too modern, her silence being too calculated, her speaking being too outspoken, because whatever she does, whatever air she breathes, whatever moment of humanity she claims for herself, it becomes fodder for this ravenous machine that must always have her name in its mouth. And at the center of that machine sits Dan Wootton, not as a journalist, not as a truth-teller, not even as a commentator, but as a ringmaster, the master of ceremonies of this grotesque circus who knows that his job is not to inform, but to keep the elephants marching, the clowns falling, the acrobats tumbling, to make sure the audience stays just outraged enough to keep watching. And that's why Butterworth's use of the word circus cut so deep. Because it was not just a metaphor, it was an indictment, a stripping bare of what Wootton and his ilk really are. Performers, not reporters, orchestrators of a spectacle that thrives on cruelty disguised as commentary. And the irony is so thick you could choke on it. That Meghan, who they accuse of being an attention seeker, is the one who has fled across the ocean to build a quiet life, while Wootton, who claims to hate her, cannot go a single night without conjuring her into his segments, cannot let a single panel pass without her name being dragged out like a tired party trick. Because Meghan lives rent-free in his head, because without her, his monologues collapse into irrelevance, because the man who insists she is desperate for attention has built his career on being desperate for hers. That's why the laughter came so quickly when Butterworth said, "Leave her alone." Not because they genuinely believed it was laughable, but because it was too threatening to the business model to let it linger unchallenged. They laughed to protect their industry. They laughed to cover the fragility of their own livelihoods. They laughed because if they stopped to admit he was right, they'd have to face the fact that the endless recycling of Meghan's stories isn't just cruel, it's boring, it's desperate, it's stale. Admit that Meghan deserves peace, and suddenly you have to confront your own role in denying it to her. Suddenly you have to reckon with the fact that you've spent years whipping the public into a frenzy over nothing while your so-called journalism has been nothing more than performance art with a nasty edge. And this is where Dan Wootton is so central, because he thrives in that nastiness. He marinates in it, he breathes it like oxygen. His whole shtick depends on creating a villain out of Meghan so he can play the triumphant executioner night after night. He is not analyzing events, he is not providing insights, he is conducting a pantomime where Meghan is always the wicked witch, Harry is the weak prince under her spell, and the rest of the panel get to play the righteous townsfolk shaking their fists. But the problem with pantomime is that after a while, the audience tires of the same script, and that's exactly what Butterworth was channeling when he said people are exhausted. Exhausted by the repetition, exhausted by the lies, exhausted by the cheap theatrics that add nothing to public discourse. And if you want proof that Wootton and his circus colleagues know this deep down, look no further than how quickly they lash out, how quickly they sneer, how quickly they drown the truth in mocking laughter, because nothing terrifies a carnival barker more than the crowd realizing the show is rigged. Butterworth's intervention that night was a tiny crack in the facade, and Wootton's laughter was the desperate plaster slapped over it. But here's the thing, cracks spread, and the more people hear that simple truth, that Meghan Sussex doesn't deserve this, that the public is tired of this, that the circus is not entertainment but exploitation, the harder it will be for Dan Wootton to keep the tent poles upright, the harder it will be for him to pretend he's anything more than a man flogging cruelty for ratings. And in the end, when history looks back, it won't remember the sneers, it won't remember the cackles, it won't remember Wootton's monologues dressed up as news. It will remember that on that December night, someone dared to say the obvious, and the circus laughed, and in that laughter we saw the weakness, the desperation, the emptiness at the core of Dan Wootton's whole charade. But what happens when the cracks become canyons, when the flimsy scaffolding of outrage and mockery can no longer hold up the spectacle? We're starting to see it now, the slow, inexorable unraveling of a narrative stretched too thin, patched over too many times with hollow laughter and empty bravado. The audience, once enthralled, is growing restless. The faces in the crowd are no longer so easily swayed by cheap tricks and recycled punchlines. They see the repetition, the predictability, the way every story is twisted to fit a tired script. They hear the same voices, echoing the same grievances, and start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't the person in the spotlight, but the ones holding the megaphone. The spell is breaking, and in its place, a quiet skepticism is settling in. A skepticism that no amount of jeering can drown out. And as the lights dim on the spectacle, the true cost becomes impossible to ignore. The circus may have thrived on the promise of controversy, on the illusion that every sneer was a blow struck for truth, but in the cold light of day, all that remains is the damage left behind. Reputations tarnished, empathy eroded, a public left more cynical and less willing to trust. The ringleaders may still shout, still laugh, still insist that the show must go on, but the audience knows better now. They know that behind every manufactured outrage lies a simple human story, one that deserves compassion, not ridicule. And as the tent poles shudder and the laughter falters, the world outside the circus keeps turning, quietly, inexorably, toward something kinder, something real. And so, as the last echoes of applause fade into silence and the garish lights finally flicker out, we're left in the hush that follows every spectacle, a lull heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. The empty seats bear witness to the exhaustion of a public who, for too long, were asked to feast on outrage and call it entertainment, on division and call it truth. In the quiet aftermath, the masks slip, and the performers retreat to the shadows, leaving only the faint imprint of their performance on the battered sawdust floor. It is here, in this twilight, that the cost of the spectacle is felt most keenly, not in the headlines or the trending hashtags, but in the fractured trust between people, in the subtle hardening of hearts, in the way we look at one another with just a little more suspicion, a little less grace. The circus has always thrived on its ability to distract, to dazzle, to convince us that the drama beneath the big top is all that matters. Yet outside, life continues, indifferent to the noise. The world is slower here, softer, filled with the small, stubborn acts of kindness that never make the front page. Maybe, in this quiet, we can begin to remember what was lost in the spectacle, the simple decency of listening, the humility of not knowing, the courage it takes to forgive. The show may end, the tent may come down, but the story, our story, goes on, written not in jeers or headlines, but in every choice to reach across the divide,